and welcome to the Nature Garden Podcast with me, Carl Steinson, and the weekending show team from Lionheart Radio. It's a chance to take a wander down the garden path and country lane with the birds and the bees and the flowers and trees, and an opportunity to hear stories from the past and present. In this episode, from dig for victory to pick for Britain, a potted history of compost and how a recipe helped win the day in World War II with Tom Pattinson. Steve Lowe's keeping an eye on river levels and the future is looking brighter for crayfish. Tom Cadwallender's here with an exciting new feature, how to identify birds. And I will be paying particular attention, Tom. And could beavers be coming to Northumberland? Well, I love the idea, and we're joined by Mike Pratt from the Northumberland Wildlife Trust to tell us more about the plans. All coming up on the Nature Garden Podcast. The weather's been great once again for being in the garden and out and about, and we had a bit of rain as well. Get in! I've been using compost to boost the soil and to sow seedlings and pot them on, but I was wondering about it all and thinking, how much do I actually know about what I'm using? Well, Tom Pattinson's been looking into soil conditioner.
I recently mentioned composting green garden waste in a composting facility, collecting the greens and brown items together, twigs and leaves of plants, etc., putting them into the composter and leaving them over time in the presence of warmth and moisture and beneficial bacteria, and it turns out in the end into a beautiful soil conditioning substance which you can use for that purpose, or you can use it after you've sieved it, put it through a sieve to make your own potting compost. That was composting green waste. I wanted to mention today composts, which we put into pots to grow plants. There's such a wide choice available. You could be confused by all the different brands out there in the bags at the garden centre. John Innes, you name it, quite a range of them. This is the way it was way back in the 19th century, only they weren't up for sale, and there were so many different ingredients in compost, different concoctions used in the age of country gardens, huge gardens, and lots of gardeners being employed, these big country estates and houses. Throughout the 19th century, the head gardeners would put together their own compost to grow what they called stove plants, to grow tropical plants in heated stove houses, and just to grow normal plants that we see every day, chrysanthemums, etc., and vegetables, of course. They had their secret recipes and they guarded them with their lives. And this was the case until the beginning of the 1930s. And that's when a merchant, he'd been a very successful merchandiser of goods and a philanthropist, of course, John Innes, living down in Surrey, he decided to start off an institute which would look at soils and various other things because he had an interest in gardening. And that institute, in the early 1930s, developed the John Innes range of composts, which are so familiar to us today. He did not hide the ingredients of his composts. We were approaching the Dig for Victory campaign, 1939, the beginning of the Second World War, and he made it freely available to everyone in the country. So we adopted the John Innes soil-based potting compost, which still exists today. As a young gardener, I had to study the different composts, their use, etc. And of course, the ingredients are burned into my memory. A John Innes potting compost, typical, comprised 7 parts of loam, that's medium loam, that's garden soil, 3 parts of granulated peat, 2 parts of gritty sand, a 1/4 pound of John Innes base fertiliser, which contained nitrogen, potassium, phosphates, and trace elements, and a small amount, a couple of ounces of ground limestone or chalk, which was to stop the compost being too acidic, to make it neutral so it would grow a wide range of plants. John Innes potting compost number 1 was and remains that. John Innes potting compost number 2, the main difference was 2 lots of base fertiliser, John Innes base fertiliser with the NPK, a double dose. John Innes number 3 potting compost was a triple dose of that fertiliser. The difference was the first, number 1, was to grow seedlings in tiny plants. When they reached a stage where they needed potting on, a little bit more food, you used John Innes number 2. And then when they grew into really strong plants which needed supporting with more NPK, it was John Innes number 3. Gradually over time, we started returning to experimenting and making our own composts, allotment holders and amateur gardeners. And the main ingredient, peat, was always used. Peat is so good for the compost. It absorbs moisture and releases it over time as the plant requires it, holds on to the moisture. But unfortunately, there's a big problem with peat. It's a finite resource, just as coal, oil and gas are finite resources. And a few years ago, the government said they wanted to see peat phased out of all compost. Stop digging peat. Please preserve the peat bogs in this country, in Ireland and in the world. And that's the big problem at the moment.
If you've ever wondered, like me, what was that bird in the garden just now, and gone to a book or an app and then realised you haven't remembered enough about it, well, help is at hand. Tom Cadwallender is here with a new feature, and he can tell us more about the art of bird identification.
I'm often asked by people, how do I get into bird watching, or how do I learn birds? And my answer is it just takes time. But be prepared to be frustrated, be prepared to invest a lot of time to try and sort out things. But really, it's a way of start simply, think simple at first. Learn the garden birds, and you become familiar with your local birds or common birds, and then you can spread your net wider. Just as you've learnt those ones, you'll recognise something that is different, and then you start sort of away from there. So that really we should be thinking about sort of making notes about birds and how they behave and what they look like. Then we can actually go back and check with our reference material. A good field guide is very, very useful, but not necessarily something you would take in the field with you because it can be a bit cumbersome. So it's best to sort of, I think, to jot a few notes down about the bird you're seeing. And then you can go back and check. But obviously you need to have a little bit of structure in your brain. So I always think that really, as I've mentioned, you look at the local birds and you're kind of looking out for certain features. You kind of learn the bill shape. Is it conal, for example? Is it shaped like a cone? And that might indicate that it's a sparrow or a finch or a bunting, and that gets you into certain parts of the field guides. Or is it thin? Is it pointed? And that might get you into the other bit of the field guide where it's more of an insectivorous bird, where a conal bill will be a seed eater, thin bill, pointed bill will be sort of insects, and that could well be something like a dunnock that's coming into your garden. But you get the feel of the shape, and you get the feel of how they're working. But also it's quite useful to know how they behave. Is it when it's on the ground? If it is on the ground, is it hopping or is it walking? Because a blackbird will hop and a pied wagtail will walk, and that just helps to sort out some of the things. And then you think about the kind of the structure of the bird, the kind of the tails and the wings and that sort of thing. I've often been asked, can you identify this bird for me, Tom? And I'll say, well, what have you got? And they'll say, well, it's black and white and it's got a long tail. Well, for me, that could mean either a magpie or a pied wagtail, because they've both got long tails and they're both black and white. Because it's all relative, really, and you kind of get things into context. So it's helpful to understand a bit about the topography of a bird, about wing bars, where the wings are, where the rump is, eye stripes, and wing bars and rumps and under tail coverts. It's kind of helpful to have those things in your mind so you can actually jot down in your notebook really what colours, if they've got these features, what colours they are. And sometimes if it's a long tail and if it's a kind of a blackbird type of bird, but it's got a short tail, you think, well, what could that be? But you recognise that a blackbird's got a longer tail than this bird you're seeing, and that could well be a song thrush. So it's a question of you kind of get back down to the basics and actually learn how the structure of the bird looks, and you're making notes and you're trying to separate certain species. But you really, the point is you start from the common birds and you work away from there. You're making notes to check on reference material. There's some good field guides out there. The one I would always recommend is the Collins field guide. It actually is very, very good. It's obviously available in book form, but also it's available as an app on your phone, on your smartphone. And with the smartphone comes calls as well, but that's a whole nother ball game. The calls is a much more complicated thing altogether. So I would suggest in the first instances, just sort of sit down, learn the birds in your garden, the sparrows, the chaffinches, the greenfinches, the dunnocks and the blackbirds, that sort of thing. Get those in your head, find out the features of those birds, find out how they behave, and you'll kind of, it's like a building block, and you're kind of building away from there. So that's my tip for understanding and getting yourself on the first rung of that bird ID ladder. I hope that helps, and good luck.
Beavers may seem to be the kind of species we see on a David Attenborough programme in Alaska or something, but they could be heading to the north of England. Reintroduction projects are proving successful in other parts of Britain. So I asked Mike Pratt, CEO for the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, to tell us more about the hopes to bring back a clever rodent that can transform landscapes.
Well, I've come to my favourite little river spot. You might be able to hear a bit of that in the background. Just to actually say, wouldn't it be fantastic if we had beavers back in Northumberland? It's happening in all sorts of places, from Derbyshire, Cumbria, North Yorkshire and most of Scotland, so why not Northumberland? The Wildlife Trust has actually been pushing for about 10 years for this to happen, maybe around Kielder or other parts of the county, but we haven't found the right combination of partners and landowners to work with to actually make that happen just yet. But we are confident over the next year or two that will actually come to fruition, and I think that will be transformative for the landscape that we see around us. If we want to have more diversity, more biodiversity, and we want more natural ecosystems and landscapes, a wilder future for our area, then beavers are key to that. They're a keynote species in bringing back nature everywhere, because they are natural engineers, and they create these fantastic wetland areas where fish, water voles, shrews, amphibians, all of these things can really flourish across a wide landscape. So yeah, beavers are definitely part of the future, I would say, for nature in Northumberland. So let's hope we get that to happen over the next year or two. They are also great engineers, so they have a great positive effect on the human environment. So we've had lots of flooding in the county in recent years, and upstream of that, having beavers actually make dams and slow the flow into our human environments would be a great bonus as well. And this has been put in place in North Yorkshire, in the Forest of Dean and other places. So why not here again in Northumberland? Let's use our natural flood management engineers, the beaver, to come back, that was always here in the past, to help us slow that flow and actually create a more biodiverse but also a safer human environment as well into the future. So yes, a double whammy for beavers.
As we heard earlier, Tom's on the trail of compost and, well, have a listen. You might want to consider where your compost comes from and how did it get here. Over to you, Tom Pattinson.
The government set a target a few years ago for phasing out peat from composts. And the target date was 2020, and that's where we are now. By 2020, they said, we want to see no peat in compost at all. The reality is, if you go into a garden centre or any outlet that sells composts, it's difficult to find something that has not got peat in. Peat is still freely available and it's there in compost. One of the problems is the garden trade, that is the professional growers, they are allowed to continue using peat until 2030. They have another 10 years. We are not allowed to buy it, in theory. It's not in the statute of law, to the best of my knowledge, but most people are saying, okay, look at the peat bog situation. It's a natural resource and we really must stop using peat, find a reasonable alternative. The situation with that at the moment is, in the UK, we don't dig up a lot of peat from bogs ourselves, the industry I mean. In Ireland, some is dug up, but they're phasing that out. It's the Balkan states which are producing most of the peat. But Balkan states, hang on, just think of the air miles, and that's not good for the environment at all. It's not good constantly digging up peat, which is a finite resource. So, who's on board in getting rid of peat and finding something else for our compost? Well, some time ago, beginning of the year, the RHS, Royal Horticultural Society, said, okay, that's it, we're phasing out, we're not going to sell any compost with peat in by the end of the year. The National Trust were way ahead of them. In 2001, they declared a peat-free policy for all the gardens that they maintain. That's quite something. The large do-it-yourself chains are getting on board. B&Q, home-based, for example, are saying we're doing our best to minimise the amount of peat that's being used, and we're getting on to our producers of peat, the people who put the stuff together, dig it up, etc., and make the compost, and we're saying to them, we've got to stop using peat. One of those big producers is Westland, and they are in agreement we must find something different to replace peat. So what are the options? Well, at the moment, they're using substances such as composted material from the compost heap. But that is slow in producing. The local councils, recycling units, are producing quite a lot from the green garden waste that we give to them or through our bins each week, fortnightly in my case. But they're using bark fibre and wood chips ground down. That is being used as a substitute. And coir, a waste product from coconuts, the coir substance, that is used in composts as well at the moment. But people are finding, many gardeners are finding, it's not quite the same as peat. Peat is ingrained into our semi-consciousness, I think. As gardeners, you can't replace it. Well, we must. Something else they're trying is sheep's wool at the moment and bracken. I hope they do find something worthwhile because we've got to change the way we look at compost that we buy. What did I do recently during the lockdown? There I was at home. Young tomatoes needed potting on. Quite a few of the summer flowering plants, the half-hardy annuals, need potting on, and young vegetables, etc. And I ran out of compost. I'd been using the John Innes compost, by the way. I ran out. So you have to look to your own resources. So my thoughts went back to when I was a young gardener and at the horticultural centre run by the Education Authority, which I trained, initial training at. We used to make compost for courses that we ran and try and experimenting with different things. I went back to hydroponics, just growing plants in water, supporting them in some way, but getting the roots into water, putting the minerals required, NPK, into the water and keeping them happy. We tried damp sand, as long as you keep putting food into the sand, keep the sand moist, support the plant, say tomato, you can grow them. It has been done, I've done it. I was stuck without compost. But what I do is, most of my pots, plants in pots, chrysanthemums, tomatoes, when they're finished at the end of the season, I don't waste the soil they've been grown in. That's the compost they've been grown in. I save that compost, I recycle it, put it into tubs, and when I am short of compost, I simply rejuvenate that old compost, spent potting compost, by adding a base fertiliser to it and a bit of dolomitic limestone, and that helps to grow plants.
This is the Nature Garden Podcast with Carl Steinson, Tom Pattinson, Tom Cadwallender and Steve Lowe.
Steve Lowe from the Beavers Trust and Naturally Northumbria has been keeping an eye on the skies and our waterways, and he's been looking at what we can all do to save water. And he has an exciting crayfish update.
Hello again, this is Steve Lowe from Northumberland Wildlife Trust, and I'm just having a quick word from my garden, which is a lovely balmy evening today, but very aware of the dry conditions, because I've been out today looking at the River Coquet, and parts of the river are actually very low, and indeed the area I was looking at, there was hardly a trickle at all. Now I was actually at Bockenfield, which is near Eshet airfield, if anybody knows that, just off the A1, and I had the pleasure of visiting the Northumberland Zoo, where I've never actually been before, and these guys have got a lovely little enterprise down there. They're closed at the moment, obviously because of COVID restrictions, etc., but hopefully they'll be open again soon. And we've been working up a plan with the zoo to actually put in a lot of native wildlife areas, so a number of ponds and tree planting, some hedgerow. We're going to try and keep sheep out of the river, and the reasons we're doing this is to actually address the issue of silt that gets into our rivers. And the River Coquet, in parts of its stretches, has actually failed the international tests for water quality based on that silt. So anything we can do to reduce that means that we aren't having that problem, and the vast majority of it probably comes from erosion through livestock. So if we can actually keep them, the sheep or cattle, whatever, out of the river and away from that will actually help, and we've got a great opportunity to do that with Maxine and Northumberland Zoo. So we're aiming to do that shortly. Now hopefully one of the other things that we'll be doing is putting in some work to actually highlight the work of the Rivers Trust, and to try and help people understand why it's so important to look after water. And in this sort of dry conditions, it's probably a really good example of why we need to do it, because I'm looking at my plants and thinking most of them are doing okay, but all the parts and that need a bit of water, and as Tom probably would tell us, we should be trying to water quite regularly, and the best way to do that is to collect rainwater and to use it wisely, or even use discarded water from washing up, etc. So that would certainly help with our rivers as well, because of course the ultimate aim for water is to actually find its way to the coast. And on the Coquet, as I've said previously, we abstract water for our own personal domestic use. So it is very much a cycle, and everything we can do to try to aid nature effectively is going to make a difference, particularly at the moment with so little water coming from rain, etc. There's the odd bit, but not much. Then actually our groundwaters are going to be depleted as well, which has a knock-on impact to springs and things like that. So we can all play our part, in that regard. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we're actually going to be working with the zoo on native crayfish, and they're going to have a captive breeding program based there. Now we're just about to start on that with them. They're just about to start kitting it out, and in fact, if anything, the fact that there are no visitors at the moment makes it a wee bit easier for them to do that, because they're not having to close the place down temporarily. But the idea is to get some native crayfish that have been bred in captivity anyway, and breed them up in the zoo, and that will be accessible to the public. Everyone will be able to go and see these marvellous little things that just look like little lobsters, tiny little lobsters, about the size of the size of an index finger, that sort of thing, and see how they live and what they get up to. So this is going to be something that's really exciting from our point of view, a new departure effectively, and also I'm hoping that the links with the zoo will actually continue for the Rivers Trust, and we'll be able to do stuff together in the future. So once it opens, I hope everyone gets in there and supports them. And in fact, actually, they've got a Just Giving page as well at the moment, as have the Rivers Trust, to try and help us with our work. So if you put in those words as a search words, I'm sure you'll be able to find something. Thanks for listening, and I hope everyone's well.
And now, I think it's time for some jobs for the week, don't you? Over to you, Tom.
Jobs for the week. Well, the weather's been so warm, settled, accommodating recently that growth has taken off in the garden, and with that growth, of course, alongside the plants I'm cultivating, we have weeds. And it just takes, given these sunny days we're experiencing, quite warm, up to 15 Celsius occasionally last week, or even some this week, get the hoe out, hoe, in between the rows, anything at all. If they're annual weeds and you cut them off from their roots, leave them in the sun, they desiccate, they dry out, and within a couple of hours they're finished. Rake them off, put them into the composting facility if they have no seeds set on those plants, because there's some annual weeds, we call them annual ephemerals, groundsel, chickweed, that sort of thing. They have a complete life cycle once they get going in the summer of 6 weeks, from seed germinating to producing their own seed as mature plants. And of course they harbour pests, and they also compete with the plants you're cultivating for useful minerals, food and moisture in the soil. So it's not good news to have the weeds about. Get your hoe out for a short while, a 10-minute hoeing session, gentle, and you'll do a lot of good in the garden. Perennial weeds, different matter. Most of them I'm digging them out, because you can't go spraying stuff willy-nilly, I wouldn't anyway, between plants, between growing crops. So it's a question of targeting one or two perennial weeds, you know the ones I mean, and digging them out by the roots. And again, they will go, if chop them up, they will go into the composting facility if they haven't got seeds, but thick roots, for goodness sake, chop them up, otherwise they might just regenerate. In the greenhouse, I've been having a bit of fun recently, as I always do, because everything is moving on. And to me, May is tomato planting time. I mentioned before, we planted the tomatoes in the unheated greenhouse at this time of year. Mid to late May, spot on. I've had them growing on in pots. I had them in 2-litre pots with good root systems, and I've put them, a little experiment I try occasionally. I put them in the open border, in the greenhouse border. I have 2 borders, a large one and a smaller one. I've been planting them in there. I'll try and remember and put a little image on our Twitter account at Gardeners Radio, just to show you what I mean. They're growing on. I prepare the soil first. I've replenished the soil there, dug it out, put some organic matter in, well-rotted horse manure. It's been around for a year, maybe 2 years. Gorgeous stuff. I've dug that into the bottom, soaked it with the hose, then put some good soil on top, soaked that so everything is moist, ready for action. And I've planted a row, just a short row, about 6 plants, into that border, straight in, so the roots will be in the soil and the manure in no time at all, that organic material. They'll grow like billio. I'll get a good crop. I've done it before and I'm looking forward to it producing for me this year. alongside it, I have some large pots, and those large pots have some holes in the bottom, quite large size. In fact, I removed some 2 or 3 years ago. These pots, I removed about half of the base, so the roots can start off in the pot, and then they're encouraged to go down into the substrate, that's the soil, and organic matter below eventually. So I developed 2 lots of roots. I water into the pots for a short while until the tomatoes are established new roots, these mature-ish tomatoes I've been growing on. And once I know their roots are into the soil, the substrate below, I stop watering in the top. I water the substrate below, that is the level, the border. I water that, and I put the weekly feed into the pots. So I've got 2 sets of roots. My reason for doing this is sometimes if you put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and you plant your tomatoes into a border, straight into the soil, there are root diseases which attack tomatoes especially. And once they collapse and go, that's it. Here, I'm doing a belt and braces job. If the roots in the substrate, which have gone to the substrate below into the border, if they are attacked, at least I've got the possibility of keeping the roots going in the pot for a while, so I can keep collecting tomatoes. Just a little thing I try, seems to work for me, and I mention this to people who say to me, can't seem to grow my tomatoes in the greenhouse border. Try it. Apart from that, keep watering for goodness sake. Even this time of year, I had to rescue a dwarf lilac just a few days ago. Judy noticed over in the corner of the garden, the leaves were drooping. It's never happened. It's been there for, must be 10 years. It's in full bloom at the moment, and we poured water and water and water in there. It's simply drought. And now, following up with a surface mulch of that same well-rotted horse manure, and that will keep it moist, the roots cool, and it looks already as if it's reviving.
You've been listening to gardener Tom Pattinson, birder Tom Cadwallender, Steve Lowe from the Beavers Trust and Naturally Northumbria, and Mike Pratt, CEO at the Northumberland Wildlife Trust. Don't forget you can stay in touch with us at Gardeners Radio and at Tom Cadwallender, and why not check us out at allthews.naturegardennotebook.com. Bye for now.